Welcome to another exciting edition of us talking to each other about topics that we're passionate about, that we care about, that are meaningful. Can you feel the meaning? So this is a topic I don't think we could do it justice in one day. And honestly, we need to do this probably every week, but it's something I've been excited about for a long time. And then Sasha's got uh, some new things that she's been putting into our heads about it and doing a lot of interesting reading and giving some talks about it. But it's about learning as an individual and learning as an organization. And way back in primordial DevOps time, I got frustrated with the fact that you could give essentially the same tools and the same training to an organization that looked very similar to another one, and they would get drastically different results. They would get very different outcomes. And what I believe then, I mean, after some of the journey, but I believed along the way and believe very, very strongly now that the difference in those outcomes is a function of that organization's ability to adapt their behavior based on information. And we'll just put that under the banner of organizational intelligence and organizational learning. And with that, why don't we get into some of the stuff that you've been talking about? You just came back from Amsterdam and we're giving some talk on this topic. So why are you excited about this?
Yeah, so I think I've been thinking about sort of having better learning outcomes my whole life probably, right? And then at one point I realized that like there's certain stages of crisis that people go through, especially high performing people. That's like an interesting thing, right? And that like this didn't just happen to me, it happens to a lot of people around me. And I realized that people don't know certain things that help me out. So I started giving this talk probably 5 years ago. And it was at that point largely centered around growth mindset. But then like the more I learn about learning, and like literally every book I read seems to have another insight, another something related to it. And the other thing that sort of becomes evident over time is that organizational learning and personal learning are closely interrelated and cannot be seen without one another, right? So like you kind of have to help individual people learn and then build the organization, have a learning mindset, and these things are intertwined. And then again, like it keeps sort of being this thing where like it snowballs and there's more and more insight coming from different directions, and like how you can make sense of it changes over time.
So this might be too early in the conversation, but one of the things I'm fascinated with is language acquisition. I got more fascinated with it in the last few years. English is really your third language, and I'm fascinated with, and maybe there's a way to kind of tie this in, but like you have, by all measures, fluency in English, and in this history, and we've had these conversations in private, but I think it's interesting to think about that. And I'm on my own personal journey trying to get language fluency, and it's difficult because I am not surrounded by experts in that language, and I don't have a need beyond my own kind of self imposed imposed problem. Like it's something that's very different. So I think at least I'd be interested in you sharing a little bit about how your kind of personal story relates to that.
So I think like language acquisition is an interesting example, maybe, but it's um I don't know, it's hard to share an insight because it sort of happened on its own in my case. Like, right? Like I didn't have to think about it. And when I did have, so I speak a number of languages fluently, and um this was sort of a non-brainer. But then I tried to learn Spanish on purpose, and like I don't speak Spanish, right? Like I understand a few words, but I don't speak Spanish. So it sort of like puts you into that position like what are we doing in our normal sort of educational approaches that doesn't really work, because I know so many people that try to acquire a second language and weren't able to. And then I know so many people who are fluent in multiple languages. Like I have some friends that like speak the same, say, three languages that I speak, and we just speak all three languages, and it just happens. And it's like, like I'm not the sole person who's been able to achieve that outcome. Um, but this sort of brings me less to a talk about language acquisition and more to a talk about what, like, I think that our educational system is not serving our children or adults, honestly, because it's focused on the wrong things, and it's getting progressively more focused on the wrong things. Part of the problem is, like, I think the game is rigged against us. We value wrong things, and we um, this is one of the stories about where metrics go very wrong, right? And we over focus on particular metric, which is test results, and we remove all sorts of creativity out of the process, both on teacher side, on student side, and so make the system worse over time while claiming that we're improving it.
So there's a lot of deep twists and turns to go into here that I think we should go into later. But I think the point that you're making that resonates with me is that education should not be confused with learning, and that and we had a little bit of this discussion before. This is what the research I got into during the pandemic really led me, or one of the main points I was fascinated with, and I do think this is directly related to um, the technical competencies in organizations. I think language learning and programming or other kind of technical knowledge work has some very strong parallels, but you only learn a language to the level of your necessity. That's what the research suggests. And I think that the point you're making about, oh, it just happened, it didn't just happen. Like you needed on like a very fundamental level to be able to communicate in the circumstances you're in. And we don't necessarily need to go through your life story, but you don't need to communicate in Spanish, or you would.
So I think, but we talked about this before too, and the need is subjective. So it doesn't mean so I learned one language by moving into a country where the need is pretty obvious. But I learned English without moving anywhere, and I didn't really need it. Like, it wasn't required, right, in any shape or form. It was
I
very
think this
beneficial.
goes to the heart. This goes to the heart of your argument about education. It was needed, right? There's all this social fabric that you want to be part of, that you needed to be part of, that were English. And I mean, tech, for example, you can go anywhere. This is why I think it's so hard for English speakers to learn foreign languages. Business and tech are all in English, like more or less 90+% across the world. But I actually want to drag it back to the way we titled this, which is, and I think it relates to language learning. I think it relates to technical learning. And it's this notion of fear. Because one of the things, and I've I think somewhat overcome this at this point in my own like language acquisition, and certainly for most degrees in my technical learning, like you can't be afraid to try and fail, or you're never going to make progress on learning the new skill.
Yeah. So like one of the things I wanted to like related to that, but kind of in relation to the last thing too, I think you could kind of like divide the way we conceptualize learning up into like three big buckets, right? So like the first one might be like native ability, right? So like I was born to be a programmer, I was born to be a poet, I was born to be an artist. Some sort of like idea that it's some sort of internal skill set, right? And so that's highly aligned with a tradition we call human capital. Like you want to find the humans that are naturally capable of doing these things and own them by hiring them, putting on salaries, stuff like that. The second one might be like learning a language is just a data transfer problem. So like there's a bunch of words and the relationships between the words, and the goal is to just put those words in your brain. You just have to read a lot of words. They gotta have, and then all of a sudden magically you have some sort of ability, right? Because you have the right data set. And so we can call that knowledge capital, right? So knowledge management is the basis of this. IT management is the basis of this, that the value is in the information itself. And then the last one you might have, which I think is closer to my understanding from like polyglot work, people who work on learning multiple languages, which is it's actually the social context that gives you the ability to speak, right? So, and what they mean by that is two things. One, you have to have a space in which you can speak Spanish to other Spanish speakers and learn by literally doing the activity of speaking Spanish, right? But that context, it changes because at first you have to have a context in which you can speak Spanish poorly, and the rest of the social group won't just be like, yo, stop, go away. They have to actually want to interact with you. And so this idea around like fear and social systems is related to the fact that you have to actually find a context that you trust and that trusts you well enough to kind of establish a feedback loop that allows you to learn what the social system understands. And that's what we might call social capital. So you get three different ideas of how learning works. You get
I go in a like rant, right? So like obviously we've talked about like just data acquisition is not learning, right? And then like I go on huge rants in my talk about like talent and inborn abilities and how that's like it. The problem with it is it's true, but it's not, right? Like you have inborn abilities that make you better at certain things and worse at certain things, but in the long run, that's not what matters. But our entire culture progressively tells us, like, oh, you're so smart, you're so talented. Oh, you're not talented enough. Oh, you didn't qualify for the bar of an IQ. Did you know that an IQ test was designed as a measure of progress, and we make it a label that we assign to people to put them in buckets to tell them they could never move from a bucket? That's like awfully bad, right? So then the thing that you were saying about social capital, what actually matters is that you need to know that you want to solve a problem. So like I'm very into this sort of new idea to me, right? That like resonates so much is like that all meaningful learning is self-directed. Like you cannot teach me a new concept, right? I have to arrive at the new concept. You can give me the information, you can create an environment, you can facilitate learning, but it has to make sense to me in a sense that is meaningful to me, right? And the problem, again, with our educational system or our organizations or the way we structure learning is that we remove the interest, we remove the ability for the person to choose their path and be creative about it and get interested in what they're interested in. And then we sort of push things on them until it comes out of their ears. And then we wonder why we have so many problems.
There's a lot going on in my internal monologue right now, but so they're connecting, but what both of you just said, like the third bucket and the context to me, in some cases, I would argue that's the only thing, and to connect it to some of what Sasha's saying, that the context is what allows you to go from, and I totally agree with it, collecting the data is not learning, right? So this is where I would make a distinction between the difference between collecting trivia and being able to manifest new ideas. And if you're talking about, some kind of physical thing or music or chess or whatever, it's very easy to see that you can present a concept to someone. And this is the point I think you're trying to make, Sasha, that just because you saw the concept doesn't mean that you have it until you can manifest it in the right context.
That's
right. So this is.
So if I may interrupt you,
let me finish one more thing. One more thing, then you can come in. The language learning that I was referencing, this kind of like research on needing something to be able to learn it, or that you're only going to learn it to the level of your necessity, also has one of the prerequisites for really advancing your language learning is what they refer to as a language parent. And I think this directly connects to the question about fear, because the language parent role is someone who is a native speaker that is willing to exchange with you at whatever level you are in good faith, right? And so that you never have, it's not pedantic, they're not correcting you, you're babbling incoherently, and they're responding with the best possible interpretation of what you said, modeling the proper behavior. And I think that is something that's missing in so many of the organizational attempts to acquire competence in technology, because you don't have anyone good to model off of.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think so connecting it also to like the social where you have an actual valid input. So like for instance, when I moved here, I was like, it's going to be easy to learn Spanish in the States because there's so many Spanish speakers. Now, what happened is I tried to talk to people in Spanish, and they're like, we're trying to, develop code. Like, we're trying to achieve an outcome. We don't care about you speaking Spanish. We don't want to speak Spanish to you. We speak English because we're trying to communicate about a goal. So like that's the like someone has to be invested enough in you making the journey, right? And like having the time, right? But there's another, so like we sort of touched briefly on fear a number of times, but the concept of psychological safety, and like if you will, I think of it as like if you talk about growth mindset, and made this joke at Dope Says Amsterdam, it's like 5 years ago the problem with growth mindset was that nobody knew what growth mindset is, and now the problem with growth mindset is that everybody thinks they know what growth mindset is, right? So no one wants to talk
That's
about
the
it.
natural life cycle of all buzzwords, by the way.
It's like a Dallas transformation. But I think the thing about growth mindset is that like, it's basically in believing that your outcomes are set by inborn abilities versus believing that your outcomes are set by the effort you put into it, right? And that it doesn't mean that inborn abilities don't matter, but it means that like what largely matters in the long run is how you invest in yourself. Now, the reason this is so powerful in both personal and organizational settings is that imagine that you believe that everything that happens is preset, like it's predetermined. It's like my levels of IQ, or how gifted I am at programming, or how like whatever, gifted I am at languages, whatever, or how gifted I am at playing tennis, whatever it is. Like this means that every opportunity to learn, I think of as a test, right? I'm not open to consuming new ideas. No, instead I ask myself a question, am I smart enough to consume this new idea? Am I good enough to do this tennis serve, or am I forever destined to be at this level of ability and I can't do any better, right? So it's a highly limiting belief that prevents you from progressing because you're already hindering yourself. You, instead of focusing on acquiring new skill or information, you focus on fighting with yourself over whether or not you're capable of doing it.
Yeah.
Or you're not fighting with yourself at all. Like you already decided you can't do it.
Yeah. So I mean, I think like one of the things with the context part, right? Again, just to poke it down a little bit more, like you imagine wanting to learn to play like jazz bass, right? So there's certain kind of rote stuff that you could learn by yourself, as in like, I need to physically be able to manipulate this instrument. I need to know some basic scales. I could probably like imitate some other bands by listening to them on tape and stuff like that. But eventually, if you really want to play jazz, you need to find a group of other people who are willing to allow you to be the bassist in a jazz band. That's the only way you can do it. So there's a social construct eventually that's required, or social context that is eventually required in order for you to make progress. So for me, like this is what we mean by like organizational learning. It's that there's an organization of people working together that learn together and establish a set of connections and interactions that allow each of the players in the band to advance, but also allow the band itself as a unit to be more capable, right? So you can't secure being an awesome jazz bassist by yourself as an individual. You have to eventually acquire being an awesome jazz bassist in a social group. In a team.
I can play with Gen AI. Come on, Gen AI is going to solve all my problems.
It's going to solve everything. But this is also another example, effectively, of the language parent. It's the jazz parenting, right? Like you have this parentage and lineage. That's interesting.
And I think the jazz parent and the language parent, like one of the things I argue sometimes about what I see in organizations around coaching right now is that the coaches never leave you with a sense of good taste. They leave you with a set of rules. So like if you went and like worked with a jazz coach and all they did was say you must play in these scales in these times, blah blah blah, that's what you learned, but they never took you to listen to good jazz, and they never like afterwards said like, hey, what did you notice about that particular jazz ensemble? What was good about them? What was bad about them? So that you have a taste, a sense of what goodness is. That's from practice, right? I don't know why you would not just collapse back into your previous behavior. And so, like, just really simple stuff like, do you have good taste in test-driven development? Do you
Right.
know?
Part of the problem
So I
in this is that you're talking about coaches that don't have good taste.
And they probably don't have good taste, and B, they're probably not good parents. In that, like, if you said, "Could you sit down now and show me how to do a unit test?"
So
no, I
there's a
can
whole
show you the sticky.
there's a whole list of literature on how we do not learn from verbal instructions, and there's actually studies that show that sometimes you take someone who can do something and then you get them to read the verbal instruction how to do it, and they lose the ability. That happens with kids. There's studies in kids, but we learn by imitating the best or by interacting, right? So like that hackathon, like you interacting with technology, that's how you learn. And there's a whole lot of like that happening, but for some reason we just like we continuously believe that like verbally cognitively learning concepts is the thing that you should do. And like there's like an interesting study that they gave kids a bunch of like basically a game that was destined to learn mathematical concepts. And then like if they gave this thing to little kids and then tried to explain it, like here's the rules and here's how you add the blocks and whatever, there was no learn. Only a couple kids got it, and it was really difficult and not happy. And then they gave the same blocks to little kids and let them play with them for a week, like do whatever. They were like, this is a mommy and this is a daddy, and this is like, they go like cook a meal to get whatever. They just played with the blocks for a week, and then they sort of started explaining the mathematical rules of the game, and everybody got it. Right? Because you have to allow for the experimentation, for making something your own, and for exploring it in ways that are incorrect, right? To sort of figure out what it does, to have like inherent understanding of it, instead of someone just told me that pendulums swing this way, and like I have to believe that pendulum swings this way.
So like, I'm going to offer an idea that's called. I want to go ahead.
So there's this idea called work within industry, which is related to what you're saying, Sasha, and it's kind of interesting to understand the theory behind it. And so an example that they give when they're trying to explain work within industry training is, I'm going to teach you how to fold a t-shirt. There's going to be like 15 movements that you have to remember. So the way it's going to start is I'm going to ask you to just watch me fold a t-shirt, and I'm not going to verbalize at all. I'm going to actually do it at speed, the way you fold a t-shirt. And then I'm going to give you a t-shirt and say, okay, you do it. And I'm going to let you do whatever you can do until you get to the end. But the only thing I'm trying to notice as a trainer is the first mistake you make. Just the first one, like the first mistake you make. I'll let you do the rest of it. You can play with it. And then when you're done, I can say, okay, so what you missed was, and I show you very carefully the lead up until you get to the first mistake. And then I stop and I say, okay, you do it. And so the question is, can you repeat that learned behavior up to the point where the correction is happening, where you've made a mistake? And then are you able to like reproduce the rest of the folding afterwards? I don't have to. So the idea of this is like, the way you teach someone is you set up a context in which they can safely make a mistake, and that you can parent them by saying, hey, like you did great up to here. This is the area that you need to focus on next. Like you don't need to think about anything else right now. Just think about this. And so they, through experimentation, this is how they basically increase the entire, industrial base of the United States during World War II. And they use this exact same methodology over and over and over to teach people all sorts of different machines, different machining methods, everything. And I think that's an interesting way to kind of think through, like, yes, it's not I'm going to verbally explain the list of things to you, and then I expect you to memorize it and reproduce it. It's praxis. It's watching someone do the theory that allows you to correct them and help them understand where they're making the mistakes. Anyway.
And so the
So
connecting
I
is
want
to
to make
what you
a
said.
counter.
Okay.
Because I kind of reject the idea that there needs to always be this like free exploration. And I think in some cases that's actually kind of inefficient. What you need, and I believe the example that Sasha gave, the thing that was gained was this expanded context that then made the instruction relevant. But in a bunch of pedagogical artifacts, I think that there's a limit to free exploration if it doesn't get you back to some context that moves your skill. If your goal is skill acquisition.
Yep.
But I actually want to take this a little more meta up a level, and it's a conversation we've been having that I think I thought it was like a light bulb moment for me when we started having this conversation, and it connects to a bunch of the stuff people are doing with AI or whatever. And you can think about neural networks and how you program them and how they've evolved and what the transformers are doing with attention. And then this comment that came up in one of our internal conversations was about how organizational learning or organizational intelligence is a function of the connections and the connectedness of these individual capabilities within an organization, and how to get new capabilities is about encoding these new connections. It's about building these new embeddings in that socio-technical fabric. And so then, like a lot of what we've been talking about today has really mostly been focused on the individual skill acquisition, the individual learning. And to me, like the hard problem that most organizations have, there's tons of problems with individual learning, don't get me wrong, but where you really run into a problem is that you've codified so much of the org chart and the funding model that it's really hard to reorganize those connections in a way that gives you those new capabilities.
Totally.
So I think I want to bring it back to, because we're talking about personal learning, and sometimes when I talk too much about personal learning, people are like, well, what, like, what about the organization? But like, your favorite paper, Andrew, because we read papers for a living. Your favorite paper of review of organizational learning theories, and like one of the summary points is like, you cannot have organizational learning without personal learning. Because guess what? If your boss has like horrible fixed mindset and removes all the psychological safety from the room and makes experimentation feel unsafe and makes you drive towards only what they think is correct, like you're not going to have a learning organization. You're not going to have a learning organization in that subset. But like, if we think of organization as this network, the more people in the network are like sort of exhibiting the wrong behavior, the less likely the organization as a whole is to have a learning outcome and to engage in the sort of the double loop learning, as opposed to like, so how Audrey talks about, like most organizations are good at single loop learning, because like if you can't modify your behavior based on mismatch in results, like you're probably not going to make money for very long, right? So like most of us can correct behavior in sort of like a streamlined fashion, but like, can you question the assumptions?
Yeah.
I think that's the fundamental question is who can question the assumptions?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's interesting. I like to talk about that a little bit too, but I do think, like, just to point it out one more time, like, I think most people have a hard time conceptualizing what it would mean for an organization to learn as opposed to an aggregate of humans learning. So like an aggregate is just like, I got a bunch of people and they can all learn things, right? An organization, in theory, is a system of social relationships between peoples and technologies. That's a system. So the question is, can the system do things that a group of people can't do, right? In other words, can the organization itself learn? And so, I think that people have a hard time conceptualizing that a little bit and thinking about it. But I think the other way to say it is like, can a team do something that a group of individual contributors can't do? Is that a thing? Are there high performing teams because the right people with the right skills are in the right context, and that means that they can perform activities and practices that can't be performed in abstraction of that? And I think, again, to me, it seems reasonably true that at minimum, the organization creates a context in which people can learn faster. So, to use a stupid one that I always like to use, if you believe in TDD, but you don't have a CI practice in your organization, you're going to learn slower through the test-driven development process than an organization that has a good CI/CD process associated with their TDD process.
You're not only going to learn slower; it's like literally impossible for you.
That's right. So it's a whole set of technical practices that are interrelated and often, frankly, owned by or practiced by different parts of the organization, right? So you can think of the other thing about CI/CD is like it's not just for developers, right? Like CI/CD is also a way for operators to make sure that the system is in certain types of configurations and so that they have a known state and stuff like that. So
allegedly,
right? Yeah, but you get these practices that are shared and have different purposes throughout the organization, not just one. And so, again, that means that the organization can learn about itself, its products, and its environment better in certain configurations than other configurations. So in other words, is a learning organization literally an organization that itself learns that happens to also have individuals inside?
So I think like I want to come back to something you said before. It's like, is the team good because of who comprises it? So like this plugs right into the Google research. So Google tried to define, like to try to find out which teams outperform others. And so they in benefit of them, they looked at a whole ton of data. So they tried to not make assumptions. They tried to like just collect a whole ton of data and like see what comes out of it. And so their original like hypothesis was the better the individuals comprising the team, the better the team is going to perform. That's not what happened. So the biggest sort of determinant of like how highly performing the team was psychological safety, right? And that was not just like people were happier. It is people were more productive. Like sales teams were selling more. Like this is like literal actual productivity happening. And psychological safety is like defined as your ability to feel safe while making mistakes, to be vulnerable while learning, right? So like to create this absence of fear that allows you to experiment and feel safe while doing it.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to be overly blunt, how much psychological safety is currently in the entire IT environment of employment right now?
It's absolutely
Like
scary.
it's a great study, but did anybody listen to it?
But I also would say, and I do like that paper, and it's something people should look at. But it doesn't necessarily give you a prescription, right? It gives you like psychological safety is correlated with these outcomes, but it doesn't give you a method to get psychological safety.
So that brings us to another point about learning, which is learning EQ skills happens through practice. So you cannot read a study and say, oh, psychological safety matters, therefore I'm going to implement psychological safety.
I'm just gonna turn the psychological safety dial up to 11 and everything's going to be great.
Even if you have good intentions, and not all people do, but even if you have good intentions, then what happens is you profess that you are allowing your team to be psychologically safe. You profess that you have growth mindset. You profess that, all the good things are happening. And in reality, what happens is that you don't necessarily do the right thing because again, like you can't just decide you're going to behave differently tomorrow.
You can't?
Usually not.
Tiny habits?
Well, again, more theories, but like it's easier to, what was the phrase? It's easier to work your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of working, right? Absolutely. Implement your CI/CD first, then you can convince the rest of the organization that was a good thing.
Again, in the same kind of parenting theory, right? Like you don't need to implement the perfect CI/CD first. You need to implement the CI/CD that will allow your organization to understand how CI/CD works so that they can hook into it and improve it from within as opposed to being told from someone else how to do it, right? I mean, this is the same thing with all transformations that we eventually see, which is like, you can't just imitate Google. You can't just be like, well, they were successful doing X, Y, and Z, so we should do X, Y, and Z. The reason they do X, Y, and Z is because they've got a lot of smart people in a context where they're allowed to learn and experiment. And they did that, and they discovered that these things work in that context.
And you don't have the same context.
And it's a mistake to think you have the same context. And it's also a mistake to think that you can just do the things that they did and that will create the context that they
But
have.
at the same time, I want to sort of say, at the same time, we keep rediscovering the same lessons over and over again, right? We all had the moment where we read a 40-year-old book and we're like, wait, that's the same thing that someone said they came up with yesterday. Like, this is literally exactly the same thing in different words. Why aren't we able to teach the new generation, right, without like sort of relearning it the hard way every time?
Again, I mean, the argument, right, is that this is the term praxis in essence, which is what we keep rediscovering is the same basic principles and theories recur, right? Not the same implementation of those principles
Correct.
and theories. And so the question isn't like, have you tried these basic principles? You should definitely be trying those basic principles. The question is, have you thought through how those principles work in your context? Or are you just imitating behaviors of other people who happen to do those principles, right?
But again, it's complicated, right? Because imitating behavior is sometimes good, but like, you also need to contextualize. But I think that another thing that we keep sort of talking about is like, and then again, bringing back to all learning is self-directed. I at one point had a realization why, like, how you have cultural cliches, right? Like, whatever it is, I don't know. The one that comes to my mind is the one that Andrew hates, which is better is the enemy of good. Like you hear the words and you sort of understand the meaning and you sort of like, cool, I got it. And then like at one point of your life, you're like, oh, that's what it meant, right? Like, so you have I have repeatedly these moments where I'm like, these were words on paper, which I understood in theory, and then they made sense, right? So like the other one is like the complexity theory, and like that happened recently. It's not just that some problems don't have one correct answer. That's sort of like, you can understand that concept, but it's that some problems are inherently a pendulum, right? So like you swim in one direction and you make it better, 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 and then other things get worse, and so you have to swim in the opposite direction and make it better. And so like it's not that like we're so silly in tech that we keep swinging from monoliths to microservices or whatever, right? Like it's that when you solve this problem in one way and you over rotate towards that one way, you gain some benefits, but then you also gain some drawbacks, and then human nature, you over rotate the other way.
Yep. It's a dynamic balance. It's not a fixed point. And you can never achieve the fixed point. It's, achieving the fixed point in a complex system is the same thing as saying heat death, right?
There's no Nash equilibrium for complex systems.
Well, the equilibrium can be quite wide dynamics, yeah. But yeah.
So what should people do? What should someone listening to us?
Usually, I ask this question. So I think. And this is a difficult answer, but like you should practice the behavior. You should make the right thing the easy thing, and you should create a safe space for people to practice the correct, I don't know, the behavior that leads to better outcomes. And so like I'll give you an example. One of the things that comes up a lot is like, you need to be able to listen to people and like allow them the space to solve the problem, as opposed to telling them what the solution is, right? And we do this, and then in organizations we do this. Like when someone comes into the room and they're like, I have this problem, like they get 10 solutions, and like the person barely said one sentence. Like there's no way you really understood the problem. But also, if you think about it, in most cases, the person can solve their own problem. they need to be allowed the space for exploration, right? And so this is something that's very difficult to learn. So the best leaders can listen to people and create an environment in the team that team is listening as opposed to solutioning immediately. And this is a learned behavior. Like you can arrive there, but you need to practice. So you need to sort of have that space in which you can practice this skill.
So I think like one of the things I used to tell people all the time that were, young leaders is I say, hey, you know what? You need to be a rubber duck before you're a guru. You got to just listen to them explain it to you so that you actually understand what they know. And then all of a sudden, maybe they say something that you would have never thought of, or maybe they say that one thing like you're folding the t-shirt, you go, oh, there. Just rethink that little point right there. That's where you're getting stuck. I don't have to
I want to
explain.
ask a concrete question that I think is relevant to what many of our listeners have to deal with, which is like we have this conversation about platforms and having like this coalition and the commons and the commoning of these practices and technologies. When in that context, in like a platform context, right? So you're talking about organizational capabilities and these boundary spanning boundary zones of the technology. It's not just about one person solving their own problem, right?
Absolutely.
So like there has to be this fabric of the ecosystem that allows the individual solving their problem to somehow solve their collective problem. And what I think organizations need to do that is getting everyone to see that they have a collective problem, that the CI/CD or the platform or whatever you want to call it is related to every one of their selfish interests. So what would you recommend in this kind of learning context to get those boundary spanning problems to be more obvious?
So, I mean, my first thing that I always like to try to convince people of is go through all of your job descriptions where you have role descriptions and look at the responsibilities, and then just add the word with to the end of every responsibility. So you're responsible for implementing CI/CD with. What other roles are you supposed to be doing this thing with? So it's like a way of pointing out or knitting together the organization, not as a set of individuals who are individually responsible, but a set of a group of people who are a network of people responsible for getting something to work correctly. Because I think that helping people understand the relationships between roles and between practices is the kind of the first step of doing that stuff. The second kind of exercise that I usually try to encourage people to do is to try to identify boundary practices. And so we've mentioned a couple already, like CI/CD is a boundary practice. The inputs and outputs are shared by multiple teams for multiple purposes. So they don't even do the same things with the same technology. They use it for different purposes. So getting those people together to understand how that system works across different contexts can be really helpful. So people understand why you're using it the way you are. And then the last one is just a network, make a network diagram or a systems diagram of the various practices that you're trying to improve. And how they relate to each other. And then help the organization understand, listen, we're not going to make any further progress investing in TDD training if we don't improve our CI/CD training, right? Or our CI/CD practice. So understanding that often the thing that's making the learning difficult is not the specific practice, but it's the related practices that are retarding or pulling it backwards. Those are my three.
I think there's another
I want to go back to the socio-technical systems, right? And I want to say like one of the things you need to do is to plug into your humans and let them have feelings and safely express those feelings and learn. And this isn't sort of a fluffy HR thing or whatever. It comes up in very serious literature over and over again. Like if you don't allow humans to experience their emotions, like you're not going to get to good outcomes. And like we started like repeatedly try to over rationalize and like have humans actually say like, oh, and I don't allow emotions to be in, like I don't, I am fully rational, I don't get triggered or whatever. Like that's always untrue, and the more you believe that, the untruer it is, right? So
So
it's a
the thing that
certain
comes in my
stage
head,
of maturity. Go ahead.
so this related to stuff we've seen repeatedly. There's a fear in individuals and in groups when, because we've been talking about the fear preventing you from learning, where it's like the fear of a bunch of things. And this is a very concrete fear that I see, which is when you tell a group of people that have been working on a certain thing a certain way that they're going to do this new thing, then there's a fear that you are erasing their job, that you're erasing their identity. Absolutely. And so there's the individual implications of that and what that's going to help or hinder them from learning. And then there's the organizational implications of that. And I think when you start talking about, whatever buzzwords you want to rub on it, and it's only going to get crazier if you throw AI into the middle of it. Like how can you?
I was just thinking that, right? Like how many people are experiencing tremendous amounts of fear right now because of Gen AI stuff, and just compounded by the fact that there's actual layoffs and all of that stuff. It's like, and then Gen AI is going to take over your job and whatever. Like how much the psychological safety of all of the teams out there is impacted by both the recession and Gen AI advances. And yeah.
So I'm going to throw this lingo from this other stuff we've been thinking about, the organizational intelligence. And there's this framing for organizational ignorance. And the framing is these 4 dimensions of problems that organizations face when dealing with new information. And the 4 dimensions are uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and equivocality. Which
equivocality was an interesting one, right? Because it's like, it's not just ambiguous, it's that different people have different definitions for the same thing.
Yep.
Well, there's competing models in the conversation, and maybe the models are giving you different course of action. So how you resolve,
which happens all the time. It's probably one of the biggest things, right? Because on the boundaries between teams, you have the competing models, and then the teams don't understand each other and drive towards the incentives that they were given.
Or even worse, they've been given incentives to be at odds with each other. So given that, uncertainty, complexity, like how as an organization, and I might be leading the witness, because I think at a certain level, the individual is somewhat subject to the rules that have been put in place, right? So the leadership at every layer essentially makes a game for the layers below them, and how they're going to be rewarded, how they're going to be promoted, all these things. And that, to me, plays into, and I've argued this for a while now, that leadership is the prerequisite for any of these organizational learning outcomes to be possible.
Yep. I mean, like I have thoughts on 2 of them. So like the first one's uncertainty, and I think that one of the best ways of dealing with uncertainty in organizations trying to learn is to establish what's called bounded uncertainty, which just means we're willing to tolerate a certain uncertainty, like for a certain period of time or for a certain amount of money. We're going to allow the uncertainty to exist within a boundary. So like bounding uncertainty tends to make it more palatable for management and for the teams involved. They understand how long they're allowed to kind of play with it and muck around with it, right? So that's one thing. The second one is the idea of equivocation, or equivality, or whatever the term is that we were having. The idea that different concepts could have different meanings to different people. that leads us back to the same conversation we're having about boundary areas, right? So boundaries are places where that happens all the time, right? Like my meaning for this object and your meaning for this object in boundary objects are different. The thing for a leader to do there is to remember that it's not always important for everyone to agree on what the thing is. The question is whether the organization is effective, even though multiple people have different interpretations of the same thing, right? I think it's the attempt to homogenize understanding and to drive people to a single view or everybody's on the same page that in fact prevents people from being able to express their actual understanding of what's happening, because their understanding is based on their own context within the organization. And that means that CI/CD is about establishing, again, a known start state for the system versus it being a system that provides feedback to a developer on code quality. Right? Those two things, the object has different value propositions that it offers. And I don't think it's necessary to drive the organization to a single understanding of that. That's not always true. Sometimes everybody
I think
Hold on.
equivocality is my interpretation of the homework is slightly different. It's not that these different groups have, they're touching the elephant in a different place.
Yep.
It's that there's actually two different elephants, and there's a competition about which elephant we're going to ride. That's the way.
I think there's probably both, right? But I want to come back to something that you said, and you said, Jay, that it's a mistake to like try to drive to clarity and say that everybody has to have the same definition of the elephant. But it comes back to some of the leadership concepts that make it very difficult to lead in complex situations. Is that leadership is appreciated for clarity, right? People want the leader to say, we're doing this because it's the right choice, and we're going to put all of our, eggs into this basket because I know for sure this going to result in like that kind of confidence and clarity is something that is inherently appreciated in leaders.
Yep.
And so, but the best leaders, and that has actually been studied, like are people who had arrived at the ability to see the uncertainty and to not drive towards one simple solution, because the world isn't simple, right? Yep. So you kind of, as a leader, you must play this game where you like, I know there's not a single simple answer, but I, to some extent, have to talk to people like there is and lead them like we're going to be fine because I'm going to keep you safe because I know what I'm doing.
Yep. So I think again, to me, and this is something I've argued for a really long time, like one of the things people tend to confuse as leaders in complex situations is they think that the opposite of clarity is ambiguity, but ambiguity is not the opposite of clarity. Vagueness is the opposite of clarity. Being vague, not completely non-committal, that's not being clear. Being ambiguous means there's certain clear things about this, and I've left some things up to further refinement, right? So like saying pick this up is vague. Saying pick this up with your hands is ambiguous. Or you should use your left hand or your right hand, right? Like, so what needs to be understood is that clarity is not a function of detail. Clarity is a function of getting the organization to understand what you want to have happen by making the most ambiguous statements possible for them to understand that. You want to leave as much space open as possible for them to do it. Now, there's an economic question involved there, like how vague can you be? I mean, how ambiguous can you be? How much space can you leave? How much time? And that's the kind of idea of bounded uncertainty. You can't just be like, hey, we need to make money. Just do whatever you want, right? You've got to constrain the organization by being clear about certain parts and leaving other parts open for exploration. So I think, ambiguity is one of the most important tools for leaders to understand inside of a complex system. And just kind of another side note, the reason why people don't like ambiguity, the reason why people don't like unbounded uncertainty is because they value deductive and inductive rationality. And deductive and inductive rationality assumes that there's one right answer. in most complex systems, you don't need one right answer to get started. So it's entirely possible for you to use abductive logic, which accepts that there's multiple potentially equally valid options, right? Because it's a set of probabilities as opposed to an
In a
absolute.
complex system, if you gave the same answer twice, you won't get the same outcome.
That's
Well, so that I really like, right? We tried it before, it didn't work isn't necessarily a true reason to not try it again in a complex system.
that's right.
But I want to make one thing explicit related to the last little bit, which is if the leaders are exposing some of the complexity and uncertainty, that can contribute to a lot of fear in the organization. So there needs to be this. Go ahead.
Sorry. There's this study that I like, and I couldn't find it if I wanted to, but it's very relevant to the current situation. And it sort of there was an industry in which layoffs were prominent, and so some researcher went and basically followed people who were at danger of layoffs for like I think 6 months or a year. It was a pretty long period of time, and these people like were experiencing a lot of anxiety and depression and like all sorts of negative outcomes from fearing the layoff, right? And then like eventually some of these people actually got laid off, and most of them found new jobs or like new ways to solve their like sort of physical existence problems within 3 months. So pivoted to a different industry, you find another job in the same industry, all sorts of things, right? So you take that and you go, you were stressed for a year about a potential problem happening. And then when the problem actually happened, you were able to resolve it like without the anxiety and like sort of relatively quickly. So we again, fear is what prevents us from achieving good outcomes, not the problem itself, but the ambiguity and the anxiety that it entails.
Do you happen to know what the time frame for that was? Like what years or
I need to find the study because I don't remember. Like there was like significant difference in length of but I should find the study.
So I want to tell my CTO story really quickly because it's related to the thing that Andrew said. So my first job as a CTO, I moved into this company that was about 50 years old, and they had a software product that runs libraries. And basically, I moved down, and the woman who owned the business basically gave me the keys and was like, "Here, I'm going to the beach. Don't break anything." So I could basically do whatever I wanted. And so I transformed the organization pretty quickly into like a lean, agile, Kanban-oriented organization where it was really designed so that with this idea that everybody should like contribute and figure out what they need to do. And it was like very little command and control activities involved, et cetera, et cetera. And I did it for about a year. And then one of my most senior developers came into my office and said, "Hey, listen, I want you to know something." And I was like, "Well, okay, what?" And he's like, about half the organization hates everything you've done. And I was like, "What?" He was like, "Yeah, about half this organization, we used to come here and there was a list of tasks to do and we would do those things and then we'd go home and barbecue. Like we were done, right? And you've made it so that every day we don't know what we could do. We have to think about things all the time. We have to take all these risks that we didn't sign up for." And so, one of the things that I kind of took out of that was, I think some people will hear this and be like, "Oh, well, they were just lazy, blah, blah, blah." But what I took out of it is actually when you're designing an organization, you need to understand that people have different tolerances for ambiguity, risk, exploration, et cetera. And you can't design the organization for just one type of thinking, just one mindset. You actually have to design the organization that allows people who are very good at contributing by having a task list and methodically going through that task list and making sure things are done. You have to have a place for those people. They have to have a place for people who are like, "I don't ever want to do the same thing for more than a month in a row." Those are different ways of working. They're different ways of thinking. And organizations that are successful have places for both those ways of thinking about the world, I think.
So I'll give an anecdote and then we should probably get to other work. But I'd been through my own like journey with some agile stuff, and I'd been hanging out with Alistair. So I got all these ideas about psychological safety and self-directed teams. And then the first time I inherited a fairly large team, I was like, this is it. We're gonna do the experiment. And so I basically created these new rules of engagement, which were in my mental model of how organizations should work and be designed and all these great things. It was this like ideal thing. And what I discovered is if you take a team that is accustomed to kind of command and control taskmaster style, and in like the flip of a switch, try to make it into this self-directed team, then there's a significant fraction of those people that will essentially panic. And so like from a fear perspective, you didn't do yourself or them any real favors just flipping that switch. So organizational design, I mean, this was a lesson I learned the hard way. It's not, in most cases, a green field, right? Like you have the existing, the prevailing circumstances, the prevailing context, and what you are charged with as a leader is making meaningful improvements with that context, not just setting it as the ideal, whatever ideal means to you, and hoping for the best.
Right.
Yep.
So this could lead into all sorts of things about autonomy and agency, self-directedness, and all that stuff, and also, the impact of fear and how do you actually design for psychological safety, and how do you design in the context of the larger organization, right? Because like, let's say you build a perfect team under you, what happens with the rest of the org? But we are at time, so we are going to make this a series because you cannot explore everything that exists in pertains to the concept of learning in a single day. And we were even considering having some guests probably on those streams because we all learn from each other, and it's wonderful to have a community. So
if you're out there and you like this kind of conversation and you want to be in the middle of it and you have words to say, come. I'm not going to promise Ergonautic ever answers any questions, but hopefully we won't give you answers, but hopefully you can ask better questions.
Yeah, we'd love to hear
we'll call
experiences too, for sure.
Sayonara.
Right.
Till next time.
Bye.